Okay, welcome everybody. So our speaker today is Anna Dornhaus. Um, Anna comes from Wuerzburg. She did her I don't know if you come originally from Wuerzburg, but you did your undergraduate and your PhD in Wuerzburg, um, and then did a stint at the University of Bristol. But since 2005, she has been professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Arizona. And her research has spanned from honeybees to ants to philosophy of science. And I think we're going to get some combination of that content today. So I'm very excited for this talk. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. And I will hand it over to Anna.
Yeah, thank you. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm glad to be invited back to Wuerzburg, even though it's only virtual. Like Douglas said, I finished my PhD in 2002 in Wuerzburg, so it's just exactly 20 years since I've been there. I will indeed cover a little bit of philosophy of science, but I'm trying to be very practical about it. And I realize that we don't necessarily get any formal education in thinking about that. So I've come to appreciate more that it's useful to actually think about why we're doing what we're doing or why we're doing it the way we're doing it. So that'll be kind of in the middle of my talk. Okay, I want to start by saying that from a zoomed up perspective and from a distance, many people think of ants as being very robotic, as lacking individuality, and as having incredibly noisy behavior. You know, you can disturb the trail with your finger, and then there seems to be a lot of chaos going on, and it doesn't seem to be all that coordinated or all that smart. And even in computer science, I work with a lot with computer scientists who are modeling or applying sort of swarm behaviors from ants. And even though they have a fairly sophisticated understanding of collective behaviors, they still think of the individuals as essentially, mindless automatons, but even in terms of the algorithms that they follow, pretty simple and essentially lacking in skills as individuals. But in the recent couple of decades, I would say, or maybe 4 decades, we've come to appreciate that actually insects, even tiny ones like ants, have fairly sophisticated individual behaviors. And it has in part to do with our ability to zoom in more on the individuals and really not see them from a 30,000 foot high up level. And I'm not actually going to go into detail on this because I just want to impress upon you how much the field has changed on this. But I do have some recorded lectures on YouTube if you want to hear me argue each of these points in detail. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. But we now know that even small insects, ants and bees, show not only individual personalities, they seem to have some understanding of self, they show metacognition. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. They have symbolic communication. They show teaching and social learning, where one individual learns from another, but also one individual seems to deliberately do things to help another individual learn. They obviously show goal-directed behavior. They show tool making and use. They manipulate their environment in effective and adaptive ways. And they seem to show emotional states. So far from the mindless automatons that we maybe used to think they were, it turns out they have qualitatively basically all the cognitive skills that we ascribe to humans or any other animal. To give you a quick example of what I mean by that, so metacognition, I'm using the word loosely, is essentially the skill to know what you know, to somehow reflect, not consciously, we don't know anything about consciousness, but to reflect on what it is, when you should use which cognitive skill or what cognitive skills you already have. And to give you an example from my lab, Amy Dunlap was a postdoc in my lab some years ago. She studied bumblebees and bumblebee learning. And for example, we had this experiment where bumblebees were actually walking through a very long tunnel that repeatedly split into these repeated Y mazes. And the bees were making 100 decisions in a row between yellow and blue. And because they were making so many decisions, we were able to manipulate what this medium long-term, long-term for a lab experiment, not probably long-term for the bees, but this long series of decisions was their environment, and we could change whether the environment was stable, meaning it's always yellow, that's better, or it's always blue, that's better, or we could make the environment not stable, meaning that which of these two choices was actually the best choice, which one had the more concentrated nectar, changed either sometimes or frequently during that set of 100 choices. And it turns out bees are very flexible about learning not just which color is better, but learning how often does it change which color is better. And they sample more, meaning they check the other color more often if they know that the environment changes more frequently. Similarly, we have shown, also this is Amy's work, we showed that bees can flexibly switch between social learning and using their own private information in this experiment here, where we gave them artificial flowers that were different colors. That's their personal information, what they've learned, which color is better. But then also we glued these dead bees to some of the flowers, which were supposed to act as model bees, pretending that there's another bee foraging on this flower. And bees learn very flexibly whether it is the other bee or the color that's indicative of nectar, and choose to use the social information or the private information, depending on which one is more reliable. So that's just to give you an example of how flexible even individual insects are in their decision making, far from this initial view as quite simple, simplistic automatons. So the conclusion there is that small brains are capable, that's spelling mistake, capable of great flexibility. And of course, that's notwithstanding the fact that brains are evolved to solve particular problems, not all problems, and that they solve for good outcomes on average, not necessarily optimizing every single decision. And that all animals, humans and insects, their brains always contain a good deal of fixed algorithms as well. Now, what I wanted to talk about is there's been a fundamental change here in what we thought insects were, especially ants, from this simplistic view to the sophisticated individual cognition view. It's really been a total flip in our understanding of cognition of these individuals. And how did we get from here to there? And one might say, well, generally just science, we got new results. But what does that mean? How did that actually work? So I want to talk briefly about something called strong inference. And I want to impress upon you how hard it actually is to change somebody's mind. This idea that ants are simple automatons is still very widespread. Many people believe that and find it absolutely implausible or shocking that they may have cognitive abilities that qualitatively rival mammals or even humans. And the point of science, in my view, is always to find the truth. It's to find out what reality is really like. But a lot of people might say that that's what they want to do. But the key strength of science is to do that even against our convictions. It's to allow us to find new results or actually change our mind, even when we think we know the answer already. How does it do that? So I'm going to review briefly what is known generally as the scientific method. More technically, it's known as strong inference. That's how it's been, how it's termed in the philosophy of science. And the scientific method starts with a question. And it's important to say that, I don't know, are there faces in the way for you guys, or are they just in the way for me? Did you see the slide okay?
I think we see everything.
Okay, great. So I just want to mention that a lot of people criticize the scientific method for not focusing enough on how we even get to the question. And I am also not going to focus on that, but I'm going to say that a lot of work may go into finding the question in the beginning. So I don't want to minimize the fact that a lot of stuff that scientists do is actually about figuring out what question to ask. But that's not part of what we call the scientific method. The scientific method kind of assumes that we already have a question. And then we start to think of all the possible answers to the question. So we think about what is it that may be possible answers to this question before we even do any experiments or test it. And again, a lot of work may go into thinking of answers. So people will argue, well, scientists spend a lot of time just coming up with hypotheses, which are these answers. And yes, that's true. But the scientific method is sort of silent on how we do that, only that we do it. So we have possible answers, and we call them hypotheses about the general behavior of the system or about something interesting. And then we derive predictions. And the word prediction is often misunderstood. The prediction is not what we think will happen. It's not sort of prediction in the weather prediction kind of sense of the word. It is the implication of this particular hypothesis given the measurements we're going to make. And we always have to have two contradictory predictions. So since we have two contradictory answers, right, the whole purpose of this method is to find out, is hypothesis 1 true or hypothesis 2 true? Those are the two different answers. There has to be a difference between them, and the predictions have to be contradictory. That is the point of this method. And I'll mention a little more on why that's absolutely necessary in a minute. Okay, so we decide what we would measure, and then we make a prediction about what would the measurements look like if hypothesis 1 was true versus if hypothesis 2 was true. And then after we've done that, everything I just talked about is in this red box. We usually call that the experimental design. This is all the planning we do before the experiment actually starts. Then we make the measurements, and we compare the measurements we have to those predictions. And the essence of the scientific method is we reject whichever hypothesis made the wrong predictions. So whatever measurements we make, if prediction 2 is different from these measurements, these two seem to be in opposition, then we reject hypothesis 2. And the logical, the key tool in logic and math generally, but also in the scientific method, is that we always conclude things based on contradictions. So we actually don't ever prove something by proving that it's right. We only ever prove something wrong. So we prove that hypothesis 2 is wrong if prediction 2 does not agree with the measurements. And we only conclude hypothesis 1 by virtue of the fact that it's the only one left over. So we conclude that hypothesis 1 is the correct answer to our original question if and only if all the alternatives were rejected because they didn't make the right predictions. Their predictions didn't come true. So if you only have one hypothesis, you can never conclude anything, because if that hypothesis is wrong, well, then it's wrong. But if that hypothesis, the prediction agrees with the data, you're not rejecting anything. And therefore, you haven't gained any interesting information. So the key point is not achieving a state where the prediction agrees with the measurements. It's to make sure that all the opposite of the prediction disagrees with the measurements. Why is that so important? It's important to recognize that there may be more than two answers here, but however many answers there are, it's always possible that there are other hypotheses that we don't know about or that we haven't thought of that make the same prediction as the one that we like or the one that we think we're testing. So just because a prediction agrees with measurements does not make the hypothesis true. And just to give you a quick example of that, if the question is what shape is the Earth, and one hypothesis is the Earth is flat, the Earth is flat makes tons of correct predictions about what's going to happen. Like the sun appears to disappear under the flat disk of the Earth, right? When it goes down, when the sun sets, and it moves across the sky. And, there's all kinds of predictions the hypothesis the Earth is flat might make that actually do agree with whatever we measure. We seem to be walking on a flat surface. Those are all predictions made by this hypothesis. So having just that one hypothesis and having it make correct predictions is not useful. The only thing that is useful is to have an alternative hypothesis and to discover whether or not all the alternative hypotheses make incorrect predictions. Okay. Now, other than making the point that you always need two hypotheses in order to reject one and then conclude anything, it's important to realize that just observing doesn't cut it. So that means we do need this formal structure of going through hypotheses and predictions. And why we need it, I'm going to make this argument in the following slides, but essentially because just looking at something to see what the answer is really doesn't work. We're just very tempted to interpret everything we see in the framework of what we already believe. And even if there seems to be evidence against what we already believe, we tend to bend the evidence in our mind and refuse to accept the answer that the evidence tells us. And so this is why we need a very strong framework that basically forces us to accept an answer, even that we didn't expect or didn't like, sort of against our will. That is what this framework of strong inference is supposed to provide. So to remind you of the ants, if we're thinking of those chaotic ants on the sidewalk, it's just very easy to think that my idea that they are stupid or that they have very simplistic behavior, I can easily make predictions like it'll look chaotic if I disturb them, that will come true and that will support my hunch of how unintelligent they are. It's only when we actually rigorously test hypotheses about other cognitive abilities that it enables us to show that, in fact, their behavior is more sophisticated than it may at first appear. And I just want to give you a couple of other examples, not from the realm of ants, to hopefully convince you a little more of that. So a lot of people will argue that science is observation and that observations are the key to getting accurate result, that empiricism, I believe, of course, that empiricism is important, but what I'm arguing is that it's not enough to observe something. It has to be in the strong framework of hypothesis testing. And I'll just give you an example here. This sort of requires that you move fairly close to the screen, but if you can also imagine it in your head, imagine you're in this landscape, you're seeing the sun and the clouds and the blue sky and the trees. Now, almost everything that you think you're seeing is actually an illusion that is created by your brain. And I'll argue this, I'll say that specifically about this aspect. So if you imagine your head here, this is just showing the angles, the visual angles of what's called central vision and peripheral vision. So if you imagine you're looking down on your head here, what you're looking straight out is your central field of your vision. It's about 5 degrees. So 5 degrees is about as big as your outstretched fist. If you look at your fist, if you stretch out your arm and you look at your fist, it covers about 5 degrees of your visual field. Now, what if I told you that the only color you see in that whole visual field is in that area of your fist? Everything else you only see in black and white. So this is, of course, well known by people who study vision. That's not a surprising result by me or anything. But if you look here at these angles, those are the same angles that are given here in this little graph. The cone, you have cones and rods in your retina. The red line is the cones. You only have cones in this very narrow area in the middle here. So really, when you're thinking that you're seeing this big color picture with the blue sky and the trees and so on, it's almost completely an illusion. It's assembled by your brain by flitting your eyes around the picture. But you actually only see color in this incredibly narrow piece of less than 10 degrees in the middle. So the peak is very steep, maximal color vision is really only a couple of degrees in the very middle of your visual field. Now I want to show you another fun one, I think. I hope the video will work. So not only are you wrong about what you think you're seeing or observing, you also insist, despite evidence, that what you're seeing must be right. Now, this is my friend Nick. He's holding a real object in front of a real mirror. There's no video manipulation here or whatever. The object, the blue object in the top is what you see in the mirror. The blue object in the bottom is the same object held at the same second. And it's impossible to accept that it's the same object because it looks like it's either 4 circles or it looks like a 4-cornered star. And of course, it's a visual illusion, but it's not because it's printed on paper. It's an actual 3D object. And it shows you that your mind is just making up what this object actually looks like. And I can show you a freeze frame of this. So you can watch this as many times as you like. You can't make your brain see the object the way that it actually is. And here is a frozen version of this video where you can see that it's sort of a wonky shape with including a wonky top surface that creates this visual illusion. But my point here is not only that it's a cool visual illusion. My point here is that your brain is making you see the object in a certain way. And even if you know that that view is wrong, you can't flip, you can't make it seem something else. You can't make it seem like that when you're looking at this video. Okay, so optical illusions are fun, but my argument, of course, is that the real world is the same. And we see something that makes us believe it, but that does not make it accurate. And there's much research on this, of course, not just in the field of vision. Here's a quote from a book by Duncan Watts, in which he says, mistaken eyewitness identification is responsible for more convictions of the innocent than all other factors combined, which is, of course, a serious version of the story of just observing something does not make it reliable. Okay, how does this now apply to collective behavior? I want to make the argument that collective behavior is both sophisticated and simple, and that it's very hard to see that by observation, and that we are very tempted to see ourselves in these insect societies, which is something, it's one of the reasons that we find them fascinating. It's one of the reasons I find them fascinating. But to me, it's very important that we maintain our objective stance, that we maintain our commitment to believe in strong inference and to test our hypotheses, and to actually be willing to accept whenever the data tells us that actually our hypothesis is incorrect, that we accept that our wishful thinking maybe about the collective organization is wrong, whether we underestimated its complexity or overestimated its complexity. And I'm saying this in part because I think I think by and large, I'm a firm believer in science and peer review. I think by and large, science works and peer review works. But I also think that many results have a hard time getting published, precisely because even as scientists, we have preconceived notions about what the correct answer is. And even as scientists, we fall into this trap of refusing to believe the evidence because it just seems so clear in our mind from our ultimately wrong observations of what the correct answer should be. And so as scientists and budding scientists, we should all guard against that and be very rigorous about our own ability to believe ourselves, prove ourselves wrong, or let ourselves be proved wrong by evidence. Okay, so this is saying in words what I just said verbally. So you should demand evidence for any claims. And by evidence, I mean peer-reviewed studies using strong inference. That means rejecting the alternative hypothesis with data. Okay, so I just covered essentially point 1 and 2. Our view, what is true is often wrong, and this is the result of invisible brain algorithms that process what we perceive. I didn't talk much about those algorithms, but I talked about vision, for example, and how we assemble the picture. Our brain assembles the picture outside of our conscious knowledge. And getting to the truth, making accurate statements about reality, is actually very hard. And yet that is the purpose of science. That is what distinguishes science from other fields of inquiry. And in my view, specifically strong inference is really what distinguishes science from anecdote. Okay, and the two bigger topics that I want to touch on with regard to collective organization are division of labor and communication. And I want to talk about what our evidence actually is for how and especially why those work. Okay, so when we're thinking of collective behavior, we often think of spectacular group achievements because those are just absolutely fascinating. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend viewing this video by Wolfgang Thaler, who made about an hour-long documentary about ants. I think it's called Ants, Nature's Secret Power. And one of the highlights, I think, that every time moves me is when they dig out this gigantic atta nest in, I believe it's in Argentina. So it's a leaf-cutting ant nest, which was going to be, my understanding is it's on a farmer's field and it was going to be removed anyway. And what they did is they poured concrete into it. For 3 days, they poured concrete basically into the entrance holes of the ants. And then after it had hardened, they excavated it in a big, almost archaeological dig. And so this is what you could see here, the people excavating the atta nest. There's all these fungus growing chambers, which are these bulbs here. And then there's these sort of almost highways and lots of smaller tunnels. And you can just see how fantastically complex, but not just chaotic, but organized the collective behavior of the ants was. Even though they're working in the dark, individual ants probably didn't have a view of the whole nest. And even if they did, that would be amazing too in its own way. So, and of course, this is a school of fish, and there are many complex behaviors in other animals that we see when they're acting as groups. And because it's so fascinating, and because we think of our society as being so successful as a group, it's easy to think of group behavior as being this spectacular ability to achieve things that are beyond individuals. And it's easy to think that groups always surpass individuals in their abilities. But at the same time, there are also spectacular failures of group behavior that, if we think about it, we should admit that we know many of them. These are all human examples. But flash crashes, for example, are crashes of stocks at the stock market that have to do with positive feedback between stock traders. And it's been exaggerated by many of the stock traders being AIs, so computers that react to minuscule movements in the stock market. The Mona Lisa, you may argue that it's not a failure of group behavior per se, but it is a failure if you think that the price of objects should reflect something about their intrinsic value. Then of course it's a little bit surprising that the most expensive painting in the world not only is tiny, but also has existed for a couple of hundred years before anyone ever realized that it was so special. So the Mona Lisa was only became famous when it was stolen from the Louvre, from the museum in Paris, early in the 20th century, and then recovered. And that kind of media circus around that is what made it famous and elevated it to be the most expensive painting in the world. And there are many other examples where essentially positive feedback loops between people lead to outcomes that nobody wants. In this case, it's physical movement. I don't know if you guys are too young to remember this yourselves, but not that long ago, this was in Germany, there was a big outdoor concert, and essentially 500 people got their rib cages crushed from something that was later named a human vortex. It was just positive feedback between small movements that individual people made. There was no actual emergency, there's no fire or attack or whatever. It was just this kind of positive feedback outcome. And similar here in the United States, although different, there was an innocent student who was suspected in the Boston Marathon bombing, but not by the police, by somebody else. And then millions of people forwarded his picture thinking that he was the suspect, with, of course, all kinds of detrimental consequences. Okay, anyway, so all of these examples are examples not necessarily of misinformation cascade, sometimes misinformation cascades like this one where the information is just plain wrong, but in many cases just positive feedback loops that lead to adverse outcomes, both for individuals and the group as a whole. Okay, so I've told you that group behavior can seem both spectacular and it can fail spectacularly. So what about division of labor specifically? So division of labor and individual specialization is generally seen as fundamental to our understanding of progress, both in biology and in humanities. So in biology, we think of the 5 transitions of the major transitions in evolution. So for example, from single cell to multi-celled organisms. Essentially, what we think of as the transition from single cells to multi-cells is not when many cells come together. It's when they start having a division of labor, when different cells specialize on different jobs. That's when we think of them as now being a real society, a multicellular organism. And of course, in ants, for example, we know that specialization can occur, and we think of that as being a higher form of sociality in ants. Equally in humans, this is, for example, an iPhone factory. These are people on an assembly line assembling the iPhone, and each one of these people is highly specialized on a minute task. And of course, anthropologists and most people generally see specialization and division of labor as being the key to advanced societies. And not only that, for example, this is an old hand axe, an old stone tool by humans that was used about 2 million years ago. And once this single stone tool differentiated in lots of different specialized tools and specialized implements, we think of society making great progress towards civilization. So all this might suggest that division of labor and specialization is one of those things that makes groups spectacular, that enables groups to do things that individuals could not do. But at the same time, if you're thinking of success stories, both ecological and human, if you think of species that are more successful than any other species, or if you think of people, this is Leonardo da Vinci, this is Hildegard von Bingen, if you know, what other people that we most revere a couple hundred years later, or this tool, in fact, that I just showed you, the hand axe, this is a human tool, that's the single human tool that's been in existence for the longest. It was used for almost 2 million years, 1.5 million or so continuously. People made this same tool. There is no other tool that's been in use for that long. And even modern implements, you know, this thing, for example, we all probably have something like it in our pockets. It replaces many of the tools we had when I was in grad school, like having a calendar and a clock to wake you up, an alarm in the morning, or a wristwatch and so on. So this is actually a pretty generalized tool. So what I'm saying here is, despite the fact that we think of society as becoming advanced when it has specialization, at the same time, we think of the opposite of specialization, namely generalization, as being the most powerful thing that distinguishes all powerful or all widespread and successful organisms and people. So what about social insects? We often think of social insects like this, the different castes. For example, in an atta colony, there's a queen with wings and a queen without wings, but the workers are differentiated in these different size groups. But if you actually study atta or any other ant species that has specialized parts like that, you quickly realize that this is actually an incredibly inaccurate picture of what the colony looks like. What the colony really looks like, especially a big atta colony with a queen like this, it probably has a couple of 100,000 identical individuals of this middle size, and only a few of these actually specialized parts. So really, mostly it consists of an overabundance of these generalist medium-sized ants, rather than being, as this picture suggests, very finely divided up into different castes. Okay, so now I want to show you a few data on the species that I've been working on kind of for the past couple decades. This is Temnothorax rugachilus. Temnothorax is a cosmopolitan genus that occurs in Germany as well. We sometimes call them rock ants because the ones that I study usually live in rock crevices. And we keep them in the lab under glass, so you can't see it here, but the colony is in a glass kind of envelope. And we mark the individuals with colors, as you can see here, and also in this picture. So we can follow each individual around in the colony. And I know you guys, to you guys, the quarter probably doesn't mean that much as a size comparison, but they're about 3 millimeters long. So fairly small ants. Okay, so this is just a graph showing you each ant as a row. So each horizontal line is one individual ant. And we grouped their activity into 4, these are the 4 biggest categories of what they do, being completely inactive, which implies not moving, foraging, meaning they leave the nest and collect food. Wandering inside is where they aren't, they're moving inside the nest, but they're not doing brood care, and they're not doing anything else that we can detect. So they're not grooming, they're not building the wall, not doing anything visually obvious. And then brood care is when they handle larvae. Those are kind of the 4 biggest groups of things that they do. So each horizontal line, like I said, is an individual ant, and it's colored for each of these categories, depending on whether it does more or less of the respective type of work. And the blue or teal is when they do more of that work, and yellow is when they do less of that work. And so we use an algorithm, a clustering mechanism, to cluster the ants so they're sorted according to similarity. And then not only to sort them according to similarity, but to divide them up into 4 groups. And we get these 2 groups, which are sort of the classic thing that we tend to identify, so nurses and foragers. But we also get a large group of ants that appear to mostly walk around, but they do some of the other tasks. So especially if they're black, it means they do just as much as sort of the average ant of those kinds of tasks. So the walkers do quite a bit of brood care, and they do actually do quite a bit of foraging as well. And then there's the inactives, which are the workers that mostly do nothing. And they may do some of the other things, but they do more nothing than everybody else. And my point here is that most of the ants are not one of these specialized groups, right? Most of the ants in the colonies are neither nurses nor foragers. They are these walkers and inactives, whatever that means exactly, but it means they're not specialized on the task in the way that we classically imagine the specialization in ant colonies to work. So my point here is to say, social insects, despite their reputation, are actually fairly generalized. Yes, there are specialists, but the specialists in the sense of individuals that really only focus on a few specific tasks are absolutely in the minority. And a large proportion of social insect colonies actually are not very specialized and are able and do perform a whole series of different tasks. Now, what I want to discuss a little bit is, well, what is the benefit of specialization? Why might an ant colony have more or less specialization and division of labor, or a bee colony? There are three classic reasons for division of labor, and these reasons essentially partially come from Adam Smith, who was an economist in the Industrial Revolution, but also Ed Wilson expanded on these reasons for social insects specifically, and they are most obviously contain higher efficiency of specialists. So the idea is, if you're a specialist on brood care, for example, then you can become more efficient at doing brood care, either through learning or because evolutionarily you're evolved to have specific properties that make you an ideal brood carer. A second reason is reduction of switching costs. Maybe even if you're, for example, if you think of those people on the assembly line, doing this screw or that screw, probably each of them is equally qualified to do either one of these jobs. But it's the ability to not have to switch back and forth. It's the ability to just stick to the same exact hand movement over and over again that reduces the switching cost, that makes the specialization on the assembly line more efficient. And then Adam Smith was arguing that the invention of machines was the third big contributor to increased efficiency after the industrialization. And I would argue that maybe Wilson, the equivalent of invention of machines in the social insect case, what Wilson talks about may be the invention of these highly specialized morphological casts. Okay, but even this first point that seems so obvious, that when you have division of labor, these specialists become more efficient as individuals on the task that they're specializing in. That is actually not as obvious as it might first appear. And my two favorite lab organisms, both Temnothorax rugratulus and actually, to be fair, the data I'm going to the picture is Temnothorax rugratulus, but the data is actually Temnothorax albipennis, so another species in the same genus. And then I'm going to show you data on bumblebees, Bombus impatiens. In this case, it's a North American species. So both of them have what might appear to be specialization. They have some specialists behaviorally, as I showed you before, and then bumblebees have this incredible size polymorphism. So these are sisters, both workers in the same colony. So they have a large variety of body sizes. In both cases, we could not find higher efficiency of specialists. So I'll show you first what we might expect is if we rank every individual by how well it performs a particular task and how often it does a particular task, or not just how often in the abstract, but how often relative to everyone else in the colony. So how specialized is an individual versus how well does it perform? You would expect that there's a correlation between specialization and performance if specialists are more efficient than non-specialists. What we actually found in this paper, and I'm just showing one task here, but we did this for 7 different tasks, and in none of them did we find a correlation here. Instead, it often looks kind of like this, which may be an oddness to do with some individuals performing everything, all tasks a lot, and some individuals not working very much. But in any case, there's absolutely no hint of a pattern for specialists being more effective than other individuals. And then in bumblebees, we now have a variety of studies, not all of them published, but in which we try to somehow isolate large and small workers to quantify their performance at brood care. We know that larger workers are better at foraging, and that is what they usually are specialized on. But small bees tend to do more brood care, and they are not better performers at brood care. So in this study here with the orange bars, I'm showing you colonies that were manipulated to have mostly small workers versus mostly large workers, and how many new workers, new males or new queens were raised, or total new bees were raised by colonies with just small workers versus, the difference between the colonies with small versus large workers. If small workers were better brood carers, which is the job they usually perform, then this would be a positive number, but it's a negative number in almost all cases, which essentially means that small workers are crappy at everything. They're not good brood carers, and they're not good foragers either. And we have some data on where that might be, which I'll show you in a minute. But here's a study by my student in the bottom right, where he manipulated not so much the average size in the colony, but just the overall standard deviation of worker size. So he artificially made colonies with a low amount of variation in body size versus colonies with a high amount of variation in body size. And there seems to be no correlation between that and the new either number of individuals as here or the biomass produced by the colony. So there's really no evidence that small bees or even a large variety of bees is better at doing brood care and raising new bees. Okay, and then we have another study that's also not published yet that shows that's sort of arguing slightly more indirectly about the efficiency of specialists. So if you imagine this green line here, if you imagine yourself on the green line, you're a graduate student, you're gaining experience at this task of sciencing, and your skills increase all the time, right? You become, you're an undergrad, you don't know anything, you become a graduate student, you learn stuff about PCR or how to keep the ants alive. You learn something about writing, it gets better all the time. You graduate, you become a postdoc, you still become better, you become a professor. I mean, I would argue I'm still pretty steep on the slope here. There's lots of stuff that I learn all the time. And this is generally something we kind of think of as humans, of our skill continuously improving, right? Even in the last decade of my professional life, I've learned new things, for example, about philosophy of science or about teaching. Just now we learn about online teaching. So there's new stuff that I'm learning all the time. And I feel like I'm still on this trajectory. As I gain more experience, I get better. Now, if the green line accurately describes our career or our learning, then of course, generalists will not ever be as good as specialists. If the generalist is the pink one and the blue one is the specialist, right? The generalist is the grad student who left, or the undergrad who left before grad school, or the person who does, a little bit of this task, but then does not do any more of it. Or maybe throughout their lives, they use a bicycle every once in a while, but they're not a professional bicycle rider, and so they sort of they remain at this intermediate level of experience. And so they have a low skill if they're on a green line, whereas somebody who does it all the time and keeps doing it reaches this blue level. So the specialist in the green scenario is definitely better than the generalist. But in the red scenario, if riding a bike is actually more like the red line than it is like the green line, then maybe I've reached this point when I'm 12. And then even though I never ride a bike again, and when I'm 45 or 50 now, right, I'm still here. I'm not really all that much better than I was at 12, regardless of how much bicycle riding I've done in the meantime, right? If there's really not that much gain, somebody who rides a bike every day versus somebody who only rides it once a year, if there's no difference, if more experience does not continuously lead to improvement in skill, then the generalist the generalist here is really no worse off than the specialist. And in this scenario, we really should not expect for specialists to have all that much better performance than generalists. Now the question is, people haven't really tried to measure these curves for social insect tasks, right? For a society, if you wanted to understand when is specialization beneficial, you'd have to understand what this curve actually looks like. And we don't really know what the curves looks like. But one prediction that's made that's different between these two scenarios is that in the green scenario, variation between individuals should increase as time goes on, right? If all the ants are the same age, and some ants only do brood care every few days, whereas other ants do brood care all the time, then the differences between them should increase over time, right? After 2 weeks, these individuals have lots of brood care experience. The generalists don't have a lot of brood care experience. And so the difference in their skill level should become more as time goes on, right? The difference, if you look at your high school, your fellow high school graduates, as time goes on and everybody goes into their different careers, probably the differences between you in skills have increased. Now, in ants, we find the opposite to be the case. We find that variation actually decreases with more time. So this is specifically measuring transport duration at emigrations in temnothorax ants. And so we had a first trip in the first emigration of lab-raised ants. So this is the very first time they ever doing this. Then this is the second time they're doing it. And then they have some intervening time where they can do whatever they want. And then we test them again. I think it's 1 week or 2 weeks. And then in the fifth, they emigrate several times. And in their fifth emigration, this is the first trip in the fifth emigration and the second trip in the fifth emigration. And in every case, the variation goes down with increased experience. So, and the mean actually goes down as well. So the significance here is about the mean, but there's also a decrease in variance. So the point is, you know, shorter time is better in this case because you want to take less time to achieve the same task. If variation goes down, it means individuals actually start with an incredible amount of variation and become more similar over time. Neither of these scenarios really matches that exactly, but for sure it implies that the specialists who had more time to learn, more experience accrued in this time, did not become radically better than the generalists. So maybe transporting in emigrations is more like the red curve, or with a red curve that starts at different points here for different ants with different talent. One way or another, this argues that they shouldn't specialize on this task because it doesn't really seem to be, this green line scenario really does not seem to be the case. Okay, so what I've now tried to convince you of is that these classic reasons are insufficient to explain evolution of division of labor in social insects. Not in all cases. I'm not arguing that this is never the case. Of course, there are many tasks where it is probably the case that continued learning occurs. For example, foraging in honeybees has been shown to include continued learning. And so therefore, there may well be, and in fact, we have data on reduction of switching costs in temnothorax. So these are, of course, plausible reasons to evolve division of labor. But we've also, over the years, suggested some other new hypotheses about why division of labor might evolve. And I'm just going to run through these briefly. So in bumblebees, essentially what I've already hinted at is that the small bees are just low quality workers and the big bees are high quality workers. And using empirical data on performance and a bunch of other data, we showed in a modeling study that we should expect a colony with higher standard deviation of worker sizes to perform better, especially at lower colony sizes, simply because the smaller workers are cheaper to produce, and for many tasks, it may not be worth it to produce an expensive worker when a cheap worker can do the task sufficiently well, even if it's not the same level as the expensive worker. So that's sort of an economic argument. And I won't go into the details of that economic argument, but I'm happy to explain it a little more if somebody asks me in the questions. We also showed, also theoretically, that even just the difficulty of allocating generalists. So if you have a group of generalists, that sounds great and flexible, but actually in order for them to flexibly reallocate and do the tasks that they need to do, they have to somehow communicate, or they have to somehow coordinate about who does what. And, you know, for example, I feel personally in a marriage where we now have become more generalist than it traditionally is the case, incredible amount of overhead is necessary for us to constantly coordinate who is picking up the kids, who is going to do the laundry. If it's not automatically defined who's doing what, then coordination has to happen, and that in itself can be so costly that it's not worth it. And then we have some hints of data that in bumblebees, at least, there may also be a robustness efficiency trade-off. So maybe that the small workers are somewhat more robust, even though they're not very efficient, robust to starvation in this case. So there could be other kinds of trade-offs that aren't about efficiency per se, but that nevertheless make it beneficial to have variation among workers. And then finally, this is just a long list of traits that we know vary a lot in ants. In this case, this is data from Temnothorax on mean walking speed and proportion of time spent inactives, just showing that the inactive ants really are kind of couch potatoes. Not only are they inactive, they also, even when they're walking, walk more slowly. Also turns out they're more corpulent. But in any case, the point I want to make here is just that ants vary from each other in all kinds of dimensions. And it's not clear that every single aspect of variation has to do with division of labor. Many of these aspects may have to do with other things, for example, age. So it may be that some are just immature, it may be that there are life history syndromes, or other things that aren't necessarily about specialized castes. We tend to, you know, in social insects, we often tend to interpret every single thing that varies among workers as being in the service of division of labor, but of course that need not be the case. Okay, so division of labor and worker specialization may have other reasons than we think was my point here. And I know I'm almost out of time, but I'll just quickly say something about communication, which is that communication is not always the bee's knees either. So if you imagine ants communicating about this resource that they found, they lay a pheromone trail, more ants visit the resource, it's immediately obvious that it seems that this kind of pointless searching over here can be avoided if everybody knows the resource that's already been discovered. But what if there are, in fact, other resources around? Then this strong communication about this resource may actually prevent us from finding the other resources. So there are arguments to be made about why communication is not always great. And so I'm sort of assuming people have heard of the waggle dance. Honeybees can communicate the distance and compass direction of food sources to other bees by means of the waggle dance. This is the experiment that was not ultimately the only thing, but sort of the key experiment of my PhD work that I initially did in in Wuerzburg, sorry, to manipulate the waggle dance. If you take a beehive and put it in a horizontal position, you need some provisions to do that, but you can make the dance disoriented and you can essentially prevent the bees from communicating. And then you can measure the outcome by weighing the hives. And we did the same experiment again in Arizona. My postdoc, Martina Donaldson-Matashi, did this. And to cut a long story short, what she found was that she did this experiment in a variety of different habitats where the resource distribution varied in a bunch of different ways. And if you think that communication reduces search time, so communication prevents the ants or bees that are that would otherwise be looking for resources on their own, if it prevents them wasting time searching for something that they haven't found or that they can't find, and instead tells them where the thing is more quickly, it turns out this is just not the benefit of the waggle dance. The waggle dance does not reduce search time. It doesn't make the bees find flowers more quickly. What it does do is it allows at the group level a better allocation of foragers to particular resources. So bees are actually very good at finding something on their own. But what they're not good at is exploring a whole bunch of different species of flowers in order to find which one of these flowers is the most valuable to go to. And this is what the waggle dance mostly achieves. So what the waggle dance achieves is to prevent bees from going on average to the average quality resource, and instead concentrates foragers on the best resource that's available at the time. So the function of the waggle dance seems to be quite different from what we intuited initially. And just to give you another piece of data on the same study, so also on honeybees, despite my ant picture there, what it also does, it communication concentrates. So this is an illustration of this data, but given the time, you can just focus on the illustration. So if you think of the orange circle as all the resources available, and the yellow circles as what is one forager collecting, what the communication achieves is that everybody is collecting the same thing because we're more concentrated on the most effective resources. But what that also means is that we have reduced exploration. So it means we cover less of the total number of resources available, which may be good in some cases and bad in other cases, especially if the quality of resources varies and it's a very dynamically changing picture. And we show essentially the same for ants. So both in empirical data and simulations, we show that symmetry breaking. So if you have identical resources, communication leads to symmetry breaking because of the positive feedback. Most foragers end up concentrated on one place. That's exactly the thing that led to these failures that I talked about earlier in the human systems. And the same problem is true for ants. So ants can lose track of other equally good resources, especially if this initially recruited to resource becomes unavailable. So communication generally just leads to an inflexibility at the group level that may or may not be outweighed by the benefits of communicating in the first place. Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is just to say that the degree of symmetry breaking depends on how nonlinear the recruitment system is. But I do want to show you this, which is a field study in which we had 4 hot dog pieces on this little cardboard maze. It's not really a maze, but it's sort of a star. The ants climb up on the middle here and then have a choice between 4 paths. And the paths are sort of long because they're winding. And this is almost exactly like my cartoon picture that I showed you before with the 4 chocolates in the corners. The point here is that the ants have a choice between 4 identical resources. What do they do? How much do they focus just on one of them? And it turns out this is how much do they focus, how asymmetric is their foraging. And these are 3 different ant species. And it turns out the different ant species differ in how strongly they focus on just one resource, exactly in concert with how strongly they forage based on communication. So fire ants, Solenopsis sileni, have the strongest trails, and so they also have the strongest asymmetry, and they're the most ecological dominant. And so what this hints to is that there are different strategies. There's one of Dory Murmuck's, which is to quickly discover things, grab the food and run away, and to be flexible and dynamically change which resources are being used. Versus these ants, the fire ants, are concentrating all their workers on one resource in order to beat up the competition, which they do because they are dominant. And then to switch the entire trail to a new resource, but that is a slow process. So they are not as flexible in finding and occupying new resources. And that's a trade-off that's ecologically made. Okay, so to sum that up, communication has a variety of costs. I didn't talk about the cost of communication itself, that producing the signal may carry some cost. Misinformation may be multiplied, but there's also an opportunity cost for receivers of waiting to be in a position to receive the signal. With, for example, with the waggle dance, they have to actually stay on the dance floor. They can't be flying around to search for their own things if they want to listen to the communication. There may be reduced individual efficiency for signalers, that's supposed to be an off signalers, if they have to wait to meet up with the receivers, or if the signaling actually takes time. And there may actually be a group level inflexibility and a reduced amount of innovation if communication is in place at the group level. Okay, and I think I have a couple of slides on the opportunity costs, but I'll skip that. But this is just an older modeling study showing that indeed this can be significant if you assume that in order to receive a signal, you have to not be doing something else. Okay, so to summarize, communication is often bad. Counterintuitively, group communication is not always beneficial for the group. And it really depends on how these particular costs weigh against the benefits of communication. Okay, and that's all I wanted to say. And I would like to thank all the people that have been in my group and all the different collaborators and my funders. And here's just a quick overview of other topics that I've studied that in case you want to ask me about it. So I've also worked a lot on optimal search, especially recently, spatial sorting, and collective decision making. And I want to leave you with this final note, which is that I think the scientific method is actually pretty important. It's not given, I think, the weight in our education that it should be. And it really requires that we consider alternative hypotheses, that we make predictions rather than explaining things after the fact. And of course, that we have peer review and generally argue from evidence. And that not only is it, to me, critical that we teach these things to each other and to our students, but also we have an obligation to explain and defend these points to the public. I think in the general public, it's even less well known what it is that, the public knows that scientists think they're right, but they do not know why, right? Most people in the general public have no idea why scientists think they know better than everyone else. And that is why they can lose trust in that being the case. So I think we all should take on the mantle of actually explaining these arguments to the general public in order to convince them that scientists have a reason to be arrogant like that. Okay, and there I will leave it and open up for questions. And like I said, feel free to ask me in German or English, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Thank you, Anna. Well, it is after 5 o'clock, but that was a really awesome talk, and my train doesn't come for another 40 minutes, so I want to hang around and have questions. And if anybody else wants to, let's do that. So I see a hand from Uta. Raising and clapping at the same time.
Well, I think Cassandra was first, so go first if you want, Cassandra.
I don't mind if you're already talking, then you can ask questions.
Well, so thanks a lot for the talk and all these insights, particularly also in communication and taking different perspectives on it. Like for me, it was striking to see the results on the ants, where you've shown that many of them are actually inactive. So I'm wondering, like, how can this be? Because this is a lot of cost that goes into them. So are they really inactive, or are they simply taking on tasks that are not involving movement, such as being doorman or something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we asked ourselves the exact same question. So my former student, Daniel Charbonneau, he has a series of papers on this topic. And essentially, we considered several possibilities. They are not doormen. We specifically looked for guard ants, or at least if that's what you mean. So we specifically actually designated guarding as a separate task, where we thought that the ant was really near their entrance and antenating incoming ants. The observation is very general. So even Martin Lindauer observed this in honeybees, almost a century ago, that a very large proportion of them are inactive at any one time. So I think it's a very general pattern. They could be digesting, or they could be storing food. Those are the main other tasks that would be invisible that we considered. It is true that they're often more corpulent, and by more corpulent, I mean their gastro is extended. And so we don't necessarily know exactly what they're storing in the gastro, and so they may be serving as a kind of replete. So in ants, sometimes you have individuals that are serving as living storage vessels. But it's an awful large number for that. If you're asking me for my interpretation of what they really are, I think they're young. I think they're basically young adults. They are formerly adults, but they are still so inept at work that it's better to have them just wait around until they're older. And that's saying it very flippantly, but the point is that there's a lot of different physiological traits that they have that are consistent with them being young. And you can't avoid having young people, right? You just inevitably, in order to get the efficient old people, you have to first have young people. And so I think that is why there are so many of them. However, we cannot actually objectively age them. And so we've tried, it's hard with mandible wear and so on. And they grow, this particular species, the ants, individual ants can grow to several years old. So most of them are field caught. So we don't know how old they in fact are.
Well, so it could be investment costs into education. So as humans do too.
Yes, although I think in this case, it's more physiological maturation than actual education in our sense, but yes, something like that.
I guess it's my turn to ask the question. So I read quite recently another study, and this one was particularly on political beliefs, but I think it's true more generally that older people tend to hold on strongly to preconceived beliefs, so they are less likely to change their minds. And it's maybe good that all the PIs left, otherwise they might feel personally attacked. But you said about the scientific method that you would encourage this to have a higher emphasis in education on how exactly to tackle these preconceived notions, even within scientists. But I would say that it's the PIs that do a lot of the training, and it's the PIs that review the influential papers, and it's the PIs that influence the field in general. So I would say, shouldn't this education continue later in the career development also, and not only at the younger level of PhD?
I mean, if what you said is true, then we should not worry about educating the PIs because it's futile anyway. I mean, I think we should educate the people that are available to be educated. That's one answer. But I'm actually not sure that I agree with the general point. I think there are obviously old people that will never change their minds for one reason or another about particular issues. I actually don't believe that it's true. So having been an editor at several journals and therefore having seen multiple people who I knew who they were review manuscripts, and I know that a lot of editors say this, generally graduate student reviews are the ones that are more ideological and harsher. And graduate students are very commonly reviewers of papers. So many of you are probably graduate students and may not be aware of this, but the fact of the matter is, certainly in the US, but I think it must be even more the case in Germany, that these days it's extremely hard to get PIs to actually review anything. Because we are under so much time pressure, and I will return the favor and say something slightly patronizing about grad students, but you guys just don't have a lot to do, right? So in comparison to somebody like me who has not only their research, but also teaching 2 little kids, which is kind of like having another job on the side. And I have been a grad student and I know what it's like. And I'm not saying it's not stressful, but the point is the time pressure is, you know, if you remember what it was like to be an undergrad, and if you talk to undergrads now, you probably think, oh my God, they are immature and they think they are busy, but they know nothing, right? And that will repeat every stage of your life until you retire. And so I'm only saying this to say, the fact of the matter is for editors, it's incredibly hard to get PIs to review papers. So this is not to contradict your point that many influential papers are or were reviewed by PIs, but many are reviewed by graduate students. So this is good and bad. This means that if you think the graduate students can be convinced to be flexible and actually listen to evidence, then that should be reflected in reviews, because many of them are in fact reviewed by graduate students. But it also means many papers are reviewed by people who don't have a lot of experience and maybe cling still very emotionally to their own ideas because they haven't sort of separated themselves from those ideas yet to the point that some PIs might. Others never do that. I agree with you. So, you know, I don't think we have to pass around blame about who it is that doesn't change their mind. I think we should all focus on our own minds and focus on our own work and our own reviewing activity. And of course, you know, you should say to your PI, listen, I would like to start reviewing papers. Can you pass some of those invitations that you probably get and decline to me? I recommend that to every graduate student. If you're not already doing it, tell your PI and tell the other PIs that you have in reach that you would like to start reviewing papers and that they should please recommend you to the editor. I think it's a great experience. It's a learning experience, and you will do something good for the field. And I think it'll actually really help you write papers, to be the reviewer yourself and see what it's like. What will the peer reviewers see when they review your paper? I think it's incredibly useful.
Well, my main takeaway there is that the postdocs are definitely not to blame. That's the important thing, right?
I think the postdocs have even less to do than grad students. So,
yeah,
obviously, maybe not true for you if you have a family already, but if you're a lone, single living postdoc, you should be doing a lot of reviewing, I think.
If I'll throw one question out there, and everyone, of course, is welcome to leave whenever they have to. But you opened the talk setting up this idea that social insects in general, and perhaps ants in particular, are misconstrued as little automatons, and then you moved in the direction of specialization versus generalization, and I was trying to figure out the connection there. I just wanted to ask whether I'm getting it right. It is the idea that specialization is inherently more algorithmic than generalization, and to be a generalist is to have something more purposive, more flexible, more like a decision-making agent, and less like a pure responsive thing. Is that where you're going with that?
Thanks for bringing that up. No, not necessarily. Actually, just to say why I brought it up. Well, part of me wanted to kind of link the two interests that I have of individual and collective behavior. And in part, I brought it into the talk simply because I wanted to show that we can change our minds, but that it takes sometimes decades of work to actually really change what people now think as the default interpretation, or what interpretation people gravitate to. Used to be very different on that example than it is now. That's why I brought it into the talk. But to your question, do I think that specialization or generalization sort of requires more cognitive skill, if you want to call it that? I'm actually not sure that either one automatically requires more cognitive skill. I think both of them, you could imagine very simple algorithms, right? You could imagine a specialist who's just pre-programmed to do brute care no matter what, and there's no particular cognitive skill involved. You could also imagine a generalist who's pre-programmed to just do whatever they stumble across, right? In a foraging for work kind of idea where, I'm an ant and I just amble around the nest, and if I hit a brood item, I try to feed the brood item, and if I hit the wall and it needs repairing, I'll repair the wall. And if I come near the entrance, I smell the outside world and I go outside and look for food. You could imagine that with very little cognitive skill as well. So I think this is why the automaton idea is so appealing, because it's not immediately clear why an ant actually needs these sophisticated cognitive skills. And I think in part, the answer to that is that we tend to have a simplified view of the world, right? Even individual ants, like individual people or monkeys or anything else, if they do leave the nest, they have to orient, they have to deal with weather and rocks in the road and predators and maybe elusive prey and all kinds of things that they actually do benefit from having, sophisticated cognitive algorithms for orientation and route finding and things like that, and learning where it is most beneficial to forage. So I think ultimately we as scientists like to simplify the world in our minds in order to find any explanations at all. But of course, in reality, the world has lots of contingencies in it. And that's probably what the cognitive skills are there to deal with. Why do we sometimes have more and sometimes less? I mean, I think across species, why do some species appear to have more cognitive skills than others? I think it does have a lot to do with flexibility to changing environments, maybe breadth of the food niche, things like that. But ultimately, I think there's no good general answer that anybody's found yet.
Thank you. Well, I wish very much that you were here in person and we were getting ready to take you out to dinner and continue this conversation. But alas, that'll have to wait until another occasion, I guess. But thank you so much for joining us, Anna, and wish you the best with your ongoing work.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for attending.